In this lesson, we're going to learn about gas exchange. Here are our syllabus points. Remember, this is 6.4. All right, let's talk about gas exchange. So we need to understand the difference between the gas exchange part of ventilation and what ventilation is. Ventilation is our inhale and exhale of air from the outside world into our lungs. So we also call it respiration, but that name's kind of already been taken by something else, right? So gas exchange occurs, in our lungs, but actually we need the CO2 to be removed from our lungs, and we need the oxygen to come in to feed our cells. So obviously in photosynthesis, it might be the other way around, and the gas exchange is slightly different. So gas exchange actually happens during ventilation in tiny chambers inside our lungs called alveoli. This is where the carbon dioxide and the oxygen diffuse into the places that they are needed to be, and they diffuse with their concentration gradient, so it is passive. Now, the intake of oxygen can be used for cellular respiration to produce energy and all that kind of thing, which we understand, of which a byproduct is CO2, which is the gas we exchange for the oxygen. So we get rid of it because it is a waste product. There's quite a lot of anatomy in this respiratory system, okay, so much. And it's including a lot of different organs here. So if we talk about the mouth and lungs, we've got moisture and hair to trap the dust and foreign material before the air comes into our mouth. We've got a trachea, which is our windpipe, essentially. It's got cartilage rings all the way around it to keep it open. It's got some smooth muscle in there, but sometimes this doesn't like it and starts to squeeze when you have an allergic reaction, for example. There are bronchi. You can see that the windpipe kind of branches off into two different directions, into the left and right lung. And they also have smooth muscles in their walls to decide how much air to let through, to contract and dilate. And then those bronchi branch off into bronchioles. They're the smaller versions of these little branches in the lungs. Once we get to that part, we'll see the lung actually has some lobes, and our left side has 2 lobes and our right side has 3 lobes, because our left side has to accommodate for the heart in that space as well. But inside the lungs, we're not just big open balloons. What we have are tiny little chambers where the gas exchange occurs via the tiny capillaries, and we'll talk more about them. Don't forget, there's quite a lot of muscles involved in this system, and the diaphragm is one of them, right? It sits under here, and if it has sudden contractions, that's when you get the hiccups, right? Okay, so our lungs, we just talked about the different lobes. You can see very clearly here there's 1 lobe and 2, and 1, 2, and 3 on that side. Remembering that they are not giant balloons, they are filled with tiny little air sacs, and what that does is increase the surface area. These are called alveoli, these tiny little air sacs, and they're like tiny bunches of grapes. So alveoli comes from a Latin word that means little cavity, and that's essentially what they are. So this is where the gas exchange happens via diffusion in and out of the capillaries. And you can see here the capillaries are just wrapped all the way around those alveoli, those tiny little balloons. So the oxygen must diffuse through this thin wall, right, of that alveoli in this air space here. The air comes in, and the oxygen must diffuse across the wall to be picked up by the red blood cells and carried back to the heart and then pumped around. The carbon dioxide does the reverse journey. It leaves the red blood cells as a waste product, diffuses into the alveoli, and is breathed out when we exhale. So huge numbers of these tiny chambers in our lungs mean that we have huge surface area, okay? So if we had just one big balloon style lung, number 1, it could be punctured very, very easily. Number 2, the surface area is nothing like the surface area we have because of these alveoli. Now, we have lots of different types of cells in these alveoli, and even though they look quite simple, they're just those tiny little grapes, or, tiny little balloons, really what we have to focus on are pneumocytes. And pneumocytes, if anything, is pneumo, it's related to the lungs, and cyte is a type of cell. We have 2 types of pneumocytes, type 1, type 2, very imaginative naming here, right? So the epithelial wall is mainly made of type 1 pneumocytes, and these are the ones that are actually just here. The type 2 ones are these ones that are shown. They look slightly different. They look a little bit skull-shaped here. Type 1, they're that epithelial style wall of the alveoli, that really thin single layer. They're quite flat. They're only about 0.15 micrometers thick, right? Not very much. They run right up against the capillaries, you can see here, and that's to allow that diffusion to take place. So if you think about the oxygen sitting in here and it has to get into the capillary, it doesn't have a very long way to go. It's only about a half a micrometer apart. So the diffusion distance has to be really tiny so the gas exchange can happen really, really quickly. These type 2 pneumocytes, however, have a slightly different job and they have a slightly different shape, obviously. They're a lot more round. They only take up about 5% of the surface area of that alveoli. They secrete a fluid which coats the inside of the alveoli, which has surfactant in it. So let's talk a bit more about that. Now, the type 2 ones, as I said, they secrete that moisture, and there's lots of different things in that secretion, but that moisture allows for the oxygen coming into the alveoli space, right into here, to dissolve into it, and therefore it can diffuse. The CO2 does the opposite. It can actually evaporate once it's come across here, diffused across, and has dissolved. It can then evaporate out. So surfactant is a really important addition. Here is surfactant. It's an important addition because what it does is it makes this little monolayer on the top of the moisture. It kind of looks like a backwards membrane, like our cell membrane, and those are the kinds of structures the molecules are anyway. And what it does is decrease the surface tension so that the water molecules don't stick together. If the water molecules were sticking together, then you would actually collapse your alveoli completely, and that is not what we want. We want that airspace to be deflated or able to be inflated. Now, premature babies are sometimes born with less surfactant, so their lungs collapse more easily. And it's called infant respiratory distress syndrome. And so they can be given oxygen and surfactant so those lungs work properly. If we have a look at some microscope images of these, it's mostly empty space, and that is because you've got to have that room for the air to come in from the bronchioles as well. So, we can see the nice flat type 1s here. We can also see the slightly more bulbous type 2s in that microscope image. So once again, talking about our premature babies, and you can see in this really clear, distinctive microscopy image, you can see there is not as much airspace here in these collapsed alveoli, and you can see that in the bunch of grapes formation there as well. Okay, if we have to talk about how our lungs actually work, we have to know a little bit about the particle model in physics. So if we decrease the volume that we have some particles in, the pressure is going to rise, and that, if we do the opposite, obviously the pressure is going to decrease. Now, the same applies in our chest during our gas exchange or during our actual ventilation. The gas particles want to spread to an area of low pressure, just like any kind of diffusion. Now, we're going to talk about the thorax. The thorax is kind of your chest cavity. It's the space between the neck and the abdomen, all right? And it's containing the heart and the lungs. It's not, talking about all the digestive stuff. It's just the heart and the lungs, really. And the diaphragm is this important muscle sitting underneath the lungs, and that's the one that's kind of walling off from everything else. When the diaphragm contracts, it contracts downwards, okay? It moves downwards, and what that does is open up a bigger space and allows air to come in. When it relaxes, it moves up and the air is under pressure and it starts to move out again. So those pressure changes are quite important, and it's not just the diaphragm. There's also muscles in the rib area and the abs that are doing that. So the diaphragm is pretty important though, okay? Again, when it contracts downwards, opens up that lung space as we can see here and brings the air in. When it relaxes, it pushes up again, sorry about that, and it makes that thorax space a lot smaller. The pressure becomes higher and the air floods out. Now, muscles work with a partner, essentially, and they're called antagonistic. It means they're working against one another. If you're a really antagonistic person, that's what happens. You fight against somebody. Now, muscles can only do work in one direction when they contract, okay? When they contract, they get shorter, they're doing that. So if you bend your arm up, your bicep is doing the work. When you bend your arm back, your tricep underneath is doing the work, okay? So we need to understand that because muscles, they need a partner to help them out, all right? So we talk about muscles of inspiration, we talk about muscles of expiration, okay? Inhalation, exhalation. And the diaphragm is one that we need for inspiration, as are some of the intercostals. Now, the intercostals are the ones that sit between your ribs. Have a feel, see what they're like. Right, there's a hell of a lot going on in terms of muscle contractions to allow you to breathe, okay? The diaphragm, for us to breathe in, the diaphragm's contracting, it's moving down, it's opening up that thorax space, and the abs, the external ab muscles, are pushing outwards. Now, the external and internal intercostals between your ribs are doing opposite jobs. Some of them are contracting to pull the rib cage out, while the other ones need to relax to allow that movement to happen, okay? If we flip to exhalation though, the opposite's going to happen. The diaphragm contracts, and what it does is it domes upwards, okay? The abs have to contract. If you actually contract your abs, you'll find that they push down a little bit, all right? They're going to push down into your body, but that pushes your organs upwards, right? Your intercostals then do the exact opposite that they did before, right? The external ones will relax, and the internal ones start doing all of that work and pulling it down. All right, there's a hell of a lot of problems that can happen in the respiratory system, obviously, because it's vital for our continued survival of every single cell. We have to get that oxygen in. You can obstruct the blockage. You can have an obstruction that blocks the passage from your nose, your mouth, your throat. If you're choking on food, you can have smooth muscle in your trachea tightening, which closes up your airways completely due to allergens. You can have alveoli spaces fill up. You can have your lungs punctured. There's heaps of different problems that can happen. Lung cancer is extremely common, sadly, and just like any other cancer, it's caused by chemicals or radioactive mutagens, right? Smoking causes most cases due to the mutagenic chemicals in cigarettes, and they're starting to get concerns about e-cigarettes and vaping and things like that. Passive smoking is also part of this, so if you're breathing in someone else's smoke, it can account for different cases of lung cancer. Now, some are caused by asbestos or silica, tiny little particles that are used in construction, and it's incredibly difficult to treat if you have lung cancer caused by those. Now, sometimes lung cancers can metastasize, right? There's a lot of blood going to the lungs. That means that if any part of that tumor pops out into the blood vessels, it can travel to any other part of the body. Hell of a lot of symptoms that can mean that you have symptoms of lung cancer. All right, and emphysema is our final one. Emphysema is what happens when the tiny little bunches of grapes, their walls thicken, and we start to lose all those tiny little chambers, and we just get larger chambers. And it kind of, this is a nice little depiction of it. We don't have big holes in the heart, but those what were tiny little chambers move up to be big ones. And this decreases the surface area that's available for gas exchange. So those people with emphysema are going to have shortness of breath, low oxygen in their blood, higher CO2 because they can't get rid of it, and less energy just in general. Now, this damage is irreversible, okay? Once you do damage from smoking, it is irreversible in this particular case. It's chronic and it will stay with you forever. You cannot fix this damage. All right, here are our syllabus dot points to make sure you have a read,